Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
This changed my life in just 30 days, and I did it without raising my voice. On Christmas Day, when most people were trying to fake smiles around a too-dry turkey or pretending that everything in their families was perfectly normal, my sister looked me straight in the eye, smirked, and said that I was too much to deal with. It was one of those lines that probably sounded casual to her, the kind of throwaway insult you toss when you think you are untouchable, but to me it landed like a final verdict. After years of swallowing disrespect, years of quietly paying bills she pretended didn't exist, years of answering frantic calls that always started with "I'll pay you back as soon as I can," I finally realized something. I was not difficult. I was not too much, I was just done. I did not yell, I did not cry, I did not make a scene. I took a slow sip of my drink, smiled like nothing had shifted, and decided right there that I was closing the bank of Lauren for good. Because what my sister, Kayla, never seemed to understand was that every safety net she had, the insurance card she flashed at the doctor's office, the tuition that processed each semester without a glitch, the emergency money that appeared whenever she found herself in a hole of her own digging, none of it came from magic. It came from me. My job, my planning, my steady paycheck, my overtime, my sacrifices. I kept it all invisible because I thought that was what family did. But invisibility only makes people think it was never there in the first place, and that was my mistake. So when she tossed that line at me, I did not argue. I went home, opened my laptop, and started clicking. First, I canceled the automatic transfer I had set up every month to her checking account, the little stipend she treated like a birthright. Done. Then I logged into my HR benefits portal. For years I had carried her as a dependent on my plan, even though technically she no longer qualified, and I paid the higher premiums without complaint because Diane, my mother, said, "You know how important it is for her to have coverage. She's still so young. She's still figuring it out." Well, young was starting to mean 24 and enrolled in college part-time, and figuring it out looked a lot like endless parties and dropping classes. I clicked through the portal, selected Remove Dependent, and scheduled the change for the next coverage cycle. Done. Finally, I logged into the tuition portal. I had been set up as the authorized payer for her university account because Diane once said, "It's just easier if you handle it. You know how to navigate those websites better than me." Easier for them meant I made the payments, and they pretended not to notice. I removed my information, revoked my authorization, and set the system so any future bills would go directly to her email. Done. I sat back in my chair and realized I had just undone almost a decade of quiet rescues in one evening. It was strange, not dramatic, not explosive, just calm. Like closing tabs on a computer you never needed to open in the first place. And I did not tell a soul. No big announcement, no group chat fight, no explanation. I knew the emails would start going out automatically the next day. The bursar's office does not miss a beat, and when the insurance notices land, they are not written in sentimental language. They do not say family first. They say effective termination date. When I put my phone down that night, I already had the first text from Diane. "Lauren, can we please not have tension at Christmas? This is supposed to be about love." I almost laughed. Tension? That was the word she chose. Like my sister calling me too much to deal with was just a little static in the air. I typed back, "I will respond tomorrow," and then I did not. I left it sitting there because for once, silence was the better move. The next morning, while Kayla was probably still asleep, her phone pinged with the first automated email from the bursar's office. "Tuition account unpaid. New payer required. Deadline in 2 weeks." I could picture her scrolling, frowning, and refreshing, expecting my name to still be there under authorized user. It was not. And this was only the beginning. When the first tuition email landed in Kayla's inbox and she realized that her safety net had actually been made of my patience, not of some invisible family fund that never ran dry, the fallout did not begin with her calling me directly, which would have required a degree of humility she never developed, but with her storming into the family group chat, typing in capital letters about betrayal, abandonment, and how I was sabotaging her future for no reason other than jealousy. Within minutes, Diane was in the mix, recording one of her dramatic voice notes that always began with heavy sighs and a catch in her throat, then spilling into a flood of phrases like, "This family is breaking apart," "You are tearing your sister down," and "I never thought you could be this cruel." Mark, my father, contributed his standard role of background noise, writing something vague like, "Let's not make this worse, we should all cool down," which in his language meant, "Please, Diane, handle this," and "Lauren, fix it quietly like you always do." For years I would have caved in at that point, typing paragraphs to explain myself, over-justifying every dollar, offering proof that I had not actually abandoned anyone, just adjusted a plan here or delayed a payment there, because I was desperate not to be cast as the villain. But this time I realized that their theater only worked if I accepted my role, and I decided I was finished auditioning for parts one never wanted. So instead of matching their drama, I scrolled through my organized folders, pulled out a list I had kept meticulously updated for tax purposes, and in one calm message dropped the numbers into the chat like a ledger in a courtroom. I wrote, "For the past 4 years I have paid the dependent insurance premium, averaging $600 a month. For the past 3 years I have covered tuition installments totaling over $40,000. On top of that, I have transferred roughly $8,000 in monthly stipends and handled about 5 emergency bills. That support is now concluded. If you have questions about future payments, please contact the bursar and your insurer directly." Then, without waiting for a single response, I muted the chat. It was the most powerful silence I had ever chosen, because while they kept typing paragraphs filled with accusations and emotional blackmail, I no longer had to hear it. For the first time in my adult life, I refused to let their guilt occupy my head in real time. Later, when I checked back hours afterward, the thread was exactly what I expected. Kayla had called me manipulative, saying I timed this just to humiliate her, as if my patience had been nothing more than a weapon I sharpened in secret. Diane had written that I ruined Christmas and had made her physically sick from the stress, which was her usual escalation tactic whenever she ran out of arguments. Mark had written that life is short and we should forgive, without ever specifying what he thought needed forgiving. But buried between those endless messages were texts from extended family members who almost never spoke up, cousins who had assumed Kayla was the independent, hard-working student she presented herself to be, writing privately to me things like, "I honestly had no idea you were paying for all of this," and "She always acted like she did it on her own." For the first time, the narrative cracked, and it became clear that I was not the problem, it was the image they had all sold, and I had quietly financed. Diane shifted strategies by trying to move the fight to the phone, calling me repeatedly and leaving voicemails dripping with tears, saying that families don't cut each other off, that I was letting bitterness control me, that I needed to think about how this looked to others. I knew exactly what that meant. She feared that the ledger I had posted in the chat was going to stick in people's minds, and she wanted the argument back in private where words could be twisted, context could be blurred, and emotions could override facts. But I had learned my lesson. I was keeping everything written, clear, and documented, because the truth is only fragile if you let it live in whispers and half-remembered conversations. By the second day, the chat had turned into a carousel of accusations, with Kayla swearing she would take me off the insurance herself, which revealed how little she understood about the process, and Diane claiming I would regret this when tragedy struck, and it was too late to make amends. But I did not flinch, because by then I had already opened my benefits portal, navigated to the dependent section, and hovered over the confirmation button to finalize her removal. The system gave me a clear timeline. The change would process at the next cycle, and she would be notified officially. As I sat there, finger poised above the mouse, I remembered Kayla's exact words from Christmas, "You're too much to deal with." The irony was that she was right, but not in the way she thought. I was too much to continue carrying the weight of 3 people who never acknowledged it, too much to keep playing the invisible banker, too much to keep begging for gratitude that was never going to come. And now I was about to show her, not by screaming or arguing, but by clicking a single button that would say more than any long speech ever could, "Watch me." The thing no one in my family ever wanted to admit, because it punctured the story where love meant endless rescue and rescue meant I kept everyone comfortable, is that the systems we all rely on have rules that do not bend for tears or performance. And once I decided I was done being the soft substitute for a hard boundary, I spent an entire morning letting the rules do their work while I stayed calm, thorough, and impossible to guilt, which began with a call to the benefits line at my company, where I asked the representative to walk me through, in plain language and with timestamps, the eligibility terms for dependents, the timing for removals, and the exact language that would appear in the notification, and when she confirmed. After checking my plan documents twice, that adult dependents who are not spouses, domestic partners, or qualifying students under a very specific age are not eligible beyond the coverage cycle already in motion. I asked for an email that summarized the policy in writing, requested a formal confirmation letter for my records, and scheduled Kayla's removal for the soonest allowable date, which meant that the next time she tried to hand over a card with my name to a clinic or a pharmacy, the system would do what it always does without drama or malice and simply say that coverage had ended. I did not gloat, and I did not announce a victory lap in the chat, because I had learned that the more I talked, the more they tried to drag me back into the swirl of explain yourself and defend your tone and listen to your mother. So instead, I opened a fresh document that I titled Insurance, Dependent Termination, pasted in the policy excerpt the rep had provided, inserted the date-stamped confirmation of the scheduled change, and added the past emergency room invoice from last spring that I had paid when Kayla swore she would take care of it the moment she was back on her feet, which somehow never quite arrived, then attached one more page that spelled out, in clear sentences, that any medical services after the termination date were not my responsibility, which was not cruelty but clarity, and clarity is something my family often called coldness, because it made excuses shrink and facts fill the room. From there I logged into the university portal and reached the bursar, who was refreshingly uninterested in the family soap opera and entirely focused on the ledger. And when I explained that I had revoked my payer authorization and removed my payment methods, the clerk told me the system had already generated the required notice to Kayla's student email along with the late fee timeline and the options for reestablishing a plan under her own name, and when I asked whether they needed anything else from me, the answer was no, unless I wanted a record of past payments for my files, at which point I said yes, please, send me the full history, because if there is one thing this season taught me, it is that silence without documentation is not strength. It is a trap, and I would not step back into it again. By midday, Diane's calls had moved from pleading to threatening to melodramatic, with lines like, "If tragedy strikes, you will never forgive yourself," which is the kind of emotional ransom note she had used on me since I was a teenager whenever she wanted me to change course, and, because I have finally grown up in ways that do not photograph well for Christmas cards, I texted one single reply that said, "All future questions must go to the offices directly. I will not discuss this at my home or over the phone," and I put the phone face down so I could hear my own thoughts, which had been drowned out for years by other people's panic. In the afternoon, I called the HR rep back and asked a question that felt small but mattered to me, which was whether the termination letter could include language confirming that the change was compliant and within policy, since Kayla had thrown around words like illegal and retaliatory in the chat, and when the rep said they could include a sentence to that effect, I felt something settle in my chest, not triumph but a steady relief, because I knew that when the storm came, and it always does, the paperwork would stand like a wall that does not need me to hold it up. I thought about sending all of this to the family group chat, flooding the thread with attachments and timelines and annotated screenshots, but then I realized that would only restart the courtroom where facts are considered rude if they interrupt a speech. So instead I drafted a short, composed email addressed to the entire family that said, in essence, I have concluded all financial and insurance support. The relevant offices are informed, written confirmations are attached, future communication should be in writing, and I wish you well, and I sat there reading it out loud to myself until the words stopped shaking, because even when you know you are right, breaking a family pattern feels like stepping into cold water and staying there on purpose. That was when Diane sent a photo of Kayla with red eyes and a blanket around her shoulders and a caption that read, "If something happens to her, that is on you," which was not a statement of concern. It was a weapon dressed as worry. And I looked at the screen and felt the old reflex to explain surge up like muscle memory, the desperate urge to prove that I am not a monster, that I have thought of every contingency, that I have been careful and fair and even kind, but curiosity beat panic. And I asked myself why I should keep pledging innocence to people who profit from my guilt, so I opened my email draft again, attached the insurer's confirmation and the bursar's ledger, added one last line that said, "Adults are allowed to manage their own affairs," including me, and I hovered over the send button, knowing that the moment I clicked, I would not be the family's quiet safety valve anymore. I would be the woman who stopped financing a story that was never true, and just as I took a breath to decide, my phone lit up with Kayla's name and a message that read, "You would not dare do this to your own sister," which made me smile without humor because by then the policy change was already locked, the tuition portal already updated. The confirmations already sitting in my inbox like steel, and the only question left was whether I would make the truth visible to everyone at once or let the systems deliver it for me, which is exactly where I left it, fingers steady above send, as the room went quiet enough for me to hear the sound of a door closing that should have been closed years ago. By the time the official confirmations had been filed and the offices had done what I always secretly wished they would do, draw boundaries that I had been too afraid to enforce myself, the family group chat had turned into the kind of circus you could almost admire from a distance if you ignored the fact that it was your own relatives performing the acts, because every message from Diane had grown longer and more theatrical, with strings of words about betrayal and abandonment that sounded like lines rehearsed in a mirror, while Kayla alternated between rage about losing her tuition safety net and dramatic self-pity about how she would never survive without me, even though she had spent years mocking me for being too responsible. And in the middle of all of it, I did something they did not expect and probably could not even comprehend. I said nothing at all, not for a few hours, not for a day, but for a full stretch of time that was long enough to force them to hear their own voices echoing back at them without mine softening the edges. Silence, I realized, was not surrender, because surrender is when you give up and hope someone else will spare you, but silence in this case was a decision to let the truth breathe without interference, and the truth was that Kayla was not some independent, scrappy college student. She was a grown woman who had been carried by invisible wires I strung together with my paycheck, and Diane was not the devoted, sacrificial mother she painted herself to be. She was the director of the play who shoved me behind the curtain whenever the audience clapped, and Mark, though quieter, had stood by long enough to be part of the set. When I refused to type paragraphs, when I ignored their calls, when I did not argue or justify, something shifted, because suddenly the extended family, who had always been kept on the periphery of our drama, started to ask questions that never used to surface, questions like, "Wait, so Lauren has been paying for all this time, and why wasn't that ever mentioned?" And the more those questions floated, the more Diane's performance began to look like what it was, a cover story built on my silence. At the end of that second silent day, I crafted a single statement, short enough to fit in one screenshot, but strong enough to redraw the map of the entire conversation, and I posted it to the group chat without flourish or apology. I have ended all financial support. Kayla is an adult, and she has been notified by the university and by the insurer. All offices are informed, and future arrangements are her responsibility. Please direct all questions to her. That was it. I muted the thread again and waited. Within an hour, I received 3 private texts from cousins I had not spoken to in months, each saying a version of, "I honestly thought Kayla was doing all this on her own," and one even added, "Your mom has been bragging for years about how she got her through school single-handedly." Those messages were not vindication in the childish sense of being proven right, but they were proof that silence had open space for the truth to leak out, and for once I was not the one leaking it. Diane must have sensed the narrative slipping because she escalated into what she thought would pull me back, telling me that I was killing family tradition, that every parent sacrifices equally for every child. That the scholarship at my workplace with Kayla's name on it was her badge of pride, and I did something then that even I did not expect until the idea landed in my head like a clean strike. I contacted HR and asked to reassign that internal scholarship, which had been tied to an employee's relative, to an external candidate in need, and within a week it was done, which meant Diane lost not just her talking point, but her ability to parade my sacrifice as if it were hers. And that decision felt sharper and more final than removing Kayla from insurance, because it cut off the bragging rights, not just the benefits. When the family chat saw the news, because of course HR posted the announcement publicly, Diane tried to claim it had been an administrative error, but then she called me, furious and desperate, demanding to know why I would humiliate her. And I answered in the same tone you use with a persistent telemarketer: it was never yours to brag about. That ended the call faster than I could have imagined, because she had no script ready for someone who no longer played along. What made this episode sting for them more than any money cutoff was that the extended family now saw, clearly and without spin, that the woman who was supposedly selfish, cold, and impossible was the one who had written checks, covered emergencies, and built stability, while the ones who had played the roles of saint and victim had been subsidized actors all along. And once that curtain dropped, it could not be raised again. The silence that followed was not peace, because I knew Kayla was stewing and Diane was plotting the next angle, but it was the first kind of silence I had ever chosen rather than endured, and that made all the difference. Because when you decide silence is your strategy, not your surrender, you realize that every accusation bounces off the wall you built with your own refusal to explain. And just when I thought maybe they would wear themselves out, Kayla messaged me privately, writing, "I could lose my enrollment if you don't cover this one last bill. You know it's not fair to leave me hanging like this." And I sat there staring at the message, realizing that my next answer would decide everything about who I would be going forward, because once you make exceptions, the old pattern resurrects itself. But once you hold the line, the pattern dies. I took a breath, felt the weight of years pressing on my chest, and typed back the first sentence of the decision that would change my life forever. When Kayla's private message landed on my phone, with its pleading tone dressed up as urgency and its demand disguised as desperation, I knew in my bones that this was the final test of whether I had actually changed or whether I was still the same woman who had been conditioned for years to bend, to apologize, to smooth over every crack in the family's carefully curated story. And the truth was that I had reached the point where I could not bear the weight of one more, just this once, because every single last time had stacked up into a mountain that only I was carrying, while everyone else walked freely at the base, as if the air had always been clear and the path had always been easy. I stared at her words, reread the phrase "one last bill," and realized how perfectly it captured the cycle, because there had never been a last bill, never been a final favor, never been an end to the pipeline that drained into me, and if I gave in now, I would be right back where I started, silently, financing her independence while being treated as too much to deal with when I dared ask for acknowledgement. So I chose something different, something that shocked even me when the idea fully formed, because instead of sending money, instead of bending policy, instead of using my access to fix her problem, I invited her to meet me at a coffee shop in the middle of town, a neutral place where there were no Christmas decorations to guilt me, no family photos on the walls to remind me of my role, and no closed doors behind which she and my mother could conspire. She came, irritated but curious, and she expected, I could tell from her posture and her clipped tone, that I would eventually fold, that I would slide a check across the table or log into a portal and solve everything while telling her to please just do better next semester. But instead, I pulled out a thin folder, not thick with money or paper she could sign, but filled with notes I had compiled the night before, names of offices on campus where she could apply for the student health plan, contact information for the bursar to establish a new installment agreement, details of the on-campus work-study program, a list of low-cost clinics in our area that accept walk-ins, and even a sample budget that showed exactly how she could manage if she picked up one of the part-time jobs she had always dismissed as beneath her. I laid it out like a blueprint, not for me to follow, but for her, and I told her clearly that this was the last free thing she would ever get from me, my time, my organization, my knowledge, and that after this, the work of building her own stability was entirely hers. She flipped through the pages with a mix of disdain and fear, muttering that I was being cruel, that I could solve all this with a single transfer, that my refusal was proof I had never loved her, and I let her say every word without interruption, because I wanted her to hear how hollow they sounded when spoken out loud in a public place where no one was applauding the performance. I said, "Adults are allowed to be disappointing, including me, but today I am choosing peace, and peace for me means I will not carry you anymore." She looked at me then with a combination of shock and anger that I will never forget, and for once I did not rush to soften it. Because the truth is that her shock was not about my cruelty, but about her sudden realization that the scaffolding she had leaned on was gone, and she would have to stand on her own legs for the first time. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with another tearful voice note from Diane, saying how heartbroken she was, how families stick together, how I was letting bitterness control me, but I did not play it. I did not even let Kayla hear it. Because I finally understood that those messages were not cries for unity, they were tools of control, designed to keep me entangled in a web of obligation. I simply silenced the phone and slid it back into my bag. When we finished our coffee, which she barely touched, I stood up, placed the folder in front of her, and told her that what she chose to do with it was entirely up to her, but that my role was finished. I reminded her of the unpaid emergency room bill from last spring that I had covered without hesitation, and I said that I had kept the receipt not as leverage but as proof, and now I was moving it into a folder I had renamed Paid in Full. It was both literal and symbolic, the clearest way I could tell her that the account between us, financial and emotional, was closed. I left her sitting there and walked out into the cool air, feeling something unfamiliar and liberating settle inside me, because for the first time in decades, I was not bracing for the next call, not calculating the next bill, not anticipating the next storm. I knew that within hours Diane would flood my messages again, and she did, with long paragraphs about love, duty, and shame, ending with a final text that said, "We are family." I let it sit there unread, and when I glanced at it one last time, I whispered to myself, exactly, because the truth is that being family does not mean endless sacrifice without respect. It does not mean one person quietly draining themselves so others can live in denial, and it certainly does not mean never saying no. What it means now, at least for me, is that I get to decide what kind of daughter and sister I am willing to be, and I chose to be the one who finally ended the cycle, who finally said enough, and who finally understood that silence, boundaries, and clarity are not cruelty but survival. And if anyone wants to call me too much to deal with, they can, because I would rather be too much and free than agreeable and trapped.